Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we have another case, as you saw in the title, and it's about Yara Gambirasio. This is an Italian case, and in fact, I don't usually cover Italian cases. Almost never. Actually, I think I have one on the channel that's not really Italian, since it's the Amanda Knox case. I don't know if you remember. It really does take place in Italy, but the people involved in the case aren't particularly Italian. Anyway, it's really interesting. Honestly, sometimes it feels like you're reading a thriller because it's so strange and so not complicated since it's not actually complicated, but it feels like a thriller because of how the events and the investigation unfold. You'll see what I mean in a moment. The person you're seeing right now was Yara Gambirasio, a 13-year-old girl at the time of the events. She liked sports, especially rhythmic gymnastics. She had 3 siblings. They had all grown up in the same house in Brimbate di Sopra with Fulvio and Mara, their parents. The place where they lived was a town with around 7,000 inhabitants, surrounded by groves and nature. Fulvio, her father, was an architect, and Mora, her mother, was a teacher. For generations, their families had lived in this place and were well known and active in the community. I don't have much more to say about Yara since, as you may have noticed, she was only 13 years old. There wasn't much to describe her by, other than the fact that she played sports, that she did rhythmic gymnastics, and that she had a pretty complete family. So, well, let's get to the facts. All of this begins on Friday, November 26, 2010. Yara had to go to the gym for a bit, since she was getting ready for the competition she had the following weekend. She spent almost the whole day at home, and around 5:15 p.m. she finally left, telling her mother that she had to go to the sports center and that she'd be back soon. By the way, this place was 7 blocks from her house, about 700 meters away, so it really wasn't far. She had 2 things to do there. First, she had to return a stereo, a boombox that her coach Silvia Brenna had lent her. And second, she needed to train for a while. So she left her house wearing leggings, black gym pants, a Hello Kitty t-shirt, and a jacket. She walked to the place like she did most of the time. She greeted her friends, said hi to her coach, returned the boombox, and started training. She finished training around 7, and at 6:44 p.m. is when she officially left the place. The last official contact she had with anyone was with a friend named Martina, to who she sent a text message saying they would meet next Sunday at 8 a.m. That was the last time anyone spoke with her. Yara was supposed to be back home by 7 p.m. Her mother knew this. She knew how long training took and was calmly waiting for her. The thing is, after 7 o'clock, when she still hadn't come back, her mother started to worry. It's only 7 blocks back, not a long way to walk. So at 7:11 p.m., before getting too worried, she decided to call her. Unfortunately, her phone was turned off. 20 minutes went by and still nothing, so Fulvio decided to call the police, and that's where the investigation began. The person in charge of the case was Letitia Ruggieri, someone who actually seemed like the perfect fit for handling this kind of situation. An experienced woman, described in Italian newspapers as a fierce fighter against the Sicilian mafia. She already had many years of experience and didn't waste a single second thinking. Within 5 minutes of the call, both the Italian police and the military police were already in the town searching. They started searching for her nearby, asking neighbors if they had seen her, and even looked inside the gym to see if she was trapped or if something had happened to her. But unfortunately, Yara wasn't there. The only thing known up to this point was that her teacher and her friends had seen her, and also that she had left the gym, but nothing else. So what Letitia did was bring in dogs to track Yara's scent, to find out where she might be. From the gym, the dogs followed her scent to a nearby town called Mapello. And to confirm this, they had her cell phone. Normally, cell phones connect to towers, so with this, you can get information about where someone might be or where they had been that day. It turns out that Yara's cell phone was in Mapello at 4:49 p.m. That's 5 minutes after she left the gym and talked to her friend on the phone. What does this mean? This place isn't exactly right next to the town. It's close, but not that close, so she couldn't have walked there. She must have made the trip by car. Over the next few days, they searched for clues about what could have happened. Did anyone in town see her leave? Or did her family have any arguments with her that might have made her want to leave? Did she have any friends with a car or a motorcycle? Those were the questions investigators were asking at the time. In order to reach some kind of conclusion, the police decided to check every phone that had been in the area on the day of the disappearance. They reviewed 15,000 phones. It wasn't an easy task, but they tried anyway. All these phones were intercepted, and some of them were actively being monitored. On one of these occasions, when one of the agents was monitoring one of these lines, he heard the following: "Forgive me, God, I didn't kill her." The person behind this call was Mohammed Fikri, and at that moment, he wasn't in town. During the disappearance, he was in Mapello. However, by the time they discovered this call, he was already on a ship to Tangier, Morocco. They weren't going to stop anyway, so the Italian police managed to intercept the ship. They arrived, arrested Fikri, and discovered a few things. Going through all his belongings, they found his van. Inside it, there was a mattress stained with blood. And just when they thought they had the person responsible for Yara's disappearance, it turned out they didn't. The blood on the mattress wasn't Yara's, and on top of everything, it was discovered that the person translating the calls made a mistake. They never said anything about killing anyone. Clearly, this person had nothing to do with the case. That's when they checked the gym's security cameras, where a very suspicious car appeared. This car kept circling around as if it was looking for something, going around several times, and on top of that, it passed by right when Yara disappeared. The car that appeared in the footage was white and what's known as a utility vehicle. It's this small car you're seeing right now, which is made for specific tasks. In other words, it's not something you'd normally see on the street, but rather in certain areas in very specific places. Besides this, the car had been driving through the area for several days, and on top of that, it didn't have a license plate, so it couldn't be identified. Even so, they really didn't have anything else to go on. So a month later, Yara's parents, completely worried, went to the media and said the following: "Open the door that separates her from her freedom. Please, give us our daughter back." We are a simple family, a home whose unity is based on love, respect, sincerity, and the brightness of our peaceful existence. Over the past month, we have been asking ourselves endless questions about who, what, how, when, and why this is happening to us. We're not looking for answers. We don't want to know. We're not tormenting ourselves trying to understand. We're not pointing fingers at anyone. All we want, more than anything, is for our daughter to return to her world, her town, her home, to the embrace of those who love her. We beg for the compassion of the people who have taken her. We ask you to find a spark of love in your conscience, look her in the eyes, and open the door that keeps her from her freedom. We beg you to give our daughter back to us. Help us rebuild our normal life. People know us. We have never done harm or wished harm on anyone. We have always shown that we are an open, transparent family, ready to help others. We don't deserve to go on living without Ayara's smile. Thank you. Sadly, Christmas came and went, New Year's came and went, and the family was never able to celebrate with her. Yara never came back. It wasn't until February 25th, 2011, 3 months later, that she was found. A man named Hilario Scotti was out in a wide-open field that day, testing a remote-controlled plane. He started using it and noticed it wasn't working quite right, so he stopped and brought it down. When he went to get it, he noticed something on the ground that looked like trash. When he got a little closer, he saw some shoes, and soon realized that there was actually a person there. That person was Yara Gambirasio. The body was a bit frozen, but it also showed signs of decomposition. At the same time, I should also point out that this place had already been searched, which means that whoever left her there did so after the area had been checked. He knew it had been searched. She had several cuts on her body from a very sharp object. She had her iPod and her house keys with her. Her phone's SIM card and battery were also there, but the phone itself was nowhere to be found. So let's move on to the autopsy and the rest of the investigation, which is where things start to get really, really strange and almost like a thriller because of how everything unfolds. During those 3 months that had passed, the weather had been really cold. so the body managed to freeze enough to preserve most of the evidence. The forensic doctor, Cristina Catano, found traces of lime in Ayara's respiratory system and a fiber from a rope on her clothing. She had a large wound on her head, a blow that was possibly caused by a rock, and several other blows to her body. She had been cut several times, and she didn't die from blood loss or from the cuts or blows, but rather from losing consciousness in the cold weather, from exposure to the freezing temperatures. That evidence of lime and rope fibers suggested that maybe the killer worked in construction or something similar. But it was only 2 months later that they made the biggest discovery in the whole case. And that was male DNA on her underwear. The way this piece of DNA was left indicated that Yara had fought back and injured him. It also suggested that she managed to stop him, or that something else stopped him. In other words, in the end, he didn't abuse her. 3 months later, the family was finally given her body, and they held a big tribute with all the neighbors from the town where she lived. They cried and shouted in memory of Yara Gambirasio. She was buried next to her 2 grandparents in the cemetery near the sports center. At the same time, the police made it public that, despite being outdoors, all the DNA on her had been very well preserved by the cold. They had blood, which made it easy to compare suspects. And they warned that they would search for the killer without sparing any effort or expense. During the investigation, everyone who was supposed to give DNA samples volunteered without any issues. At least the vast majority did, and in the end, they collected 22,000 different DNA samples. Each of the tests to find the perpetrator's DNA was long and tedious, but absolutely necessary. At the same time they were doing this, they also set up cameras at Yara's grave to see if maybe the culprit would try to visit her again. Meanwhile, the investigators went to a nightclub that was located near where the body was found. This place was called La Sabi Mobile. And at this point, I honestly don't know if it's because it's in Italian and I'm misunderstanding something, because the next part is strange. So the managers of the place would ask people who went to this club for memberships. So I don't know if there's a difference here, if disco meant something else. Here, it's a club, a disco, so that's why it seems strange to me. But it turns out that everyone who entered this place had to get a membership with their full name and phone number so they could be located. This helped the case a lot. So they took some samples from people who had been at this place and who might have had something to do with the case, and they found a few people whose DNA was similar to what was found on Yara's body. The main one of all was Damiano Garanoni. He, however, was almost completely ruled out of the case, since during that time he was in South America, during the period when she disappeared and was murdered, so it couldn't have been him. The thing is, his DNA was the closest match out of all the samples tested, and it was so similar that they concluded the person responsible had to be a relative of his. They started investigating his family and discovered something shocking. It turns out his mother, Aurora, had worked for the girl's family for 10 years in their home. Now, of course, they asked her about the case, and she said it was one of the worst things that had ever happened to her since, let's say, Yara grew up alongside her. She spent 10 years in that house. Yara was 13, and she had watched her grow up, had seen her practice gymnastics, had seen her several times at that sports center, had taken care of her at home, so it was something that really hit her deeply. However, apparently, she had nothing to do with it. Even so, they put microphones in the house and also tapped the phone lines so they could listen in on what they were talking about. And so after several months of investigation, they concluded that neither she, nor Aurora, nor her son had anything to do with it. However, they couldn't ignore the fact that their genetic material was so similar to the killer's. So they started looking from one family member to another, beginning with Damiano's father, Joseph. They crossed every one of Damiano's uncles off the list, except for one, Giuseppe. The reality is that they couldn't do any DNA testing on him since he had died in 1999, that is, before the murder. And you might say, well, what's the point of doing a DNA test if he's already dead and if he died before it all happened? This was actually really important. It turns out Giuseppe's widow was still alive, so she was able to give the police some stamps that had the man's saliva on them. With those, they extracted the DNA and discovered that it was very, very similar to the killer's DNA. What did this mean? It meant that the killer had to be Giuseppe's son. At that moment, it seemed completely obvious. It seemed really simple, because you think, well, that's it. Now it's the son, and we just have to look for the sons. But that's not how it turned out. Giuseppe had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter was automatically ruled out, of course, because the DNA was male, and they tested the 2 sons, thinking maybe one of them could be the killer, but neither of them matched. What did this mean? It meant that Giuseppe had an illegitimate son, and that son had killed Yara. Of course, this made the whole situation more complicated, since now they had to track down a son whose whereabouts were unknown. So to find him, they could no longer focus on the father. Instead, they had to look for the mother, who was possibly still alive. This woman would have had an affair with Giuseppe, and from that, a son, whom they never revealed to anyone. This whole issue became quite problematic. All of television was following the case as if it were a soap opera, in a rather sensationalist way, like they were watching a movie. So it was no surprise when something unusual happened in the chapel of a hospital in a nearby city. In the guest book used for prayers for family members or comments, someone had written, "Tell the Bergamo police that the killer of Yara Gambirasio was here." May God forgive me. This was considered a possible lead, but it had a lot to do with the fact that the news was covering this story as if it were a soap opera. There was a lot of attention on it, so it didn't really mean anything. While all this was happening, the police kept digging into Giuseppe's past. And it turns out that in 2013, they discovered a bit more about his life. It was revealed that in the 1960s, he had been a bus driver, whatever you call it, and that he drove in another town for 20 years. On this bus, he used to take several women to textile factories. Another thing is that his co-workers knew him as a womanizer. So they started searching local orphanages and looking for single mothers, but they didn't find anything. So they figured that the most likely scenario was that this woman wasn't single, but married, and that the child was kept secret. In other words, that she had this child during her marriage without telling her husband who the real father was. That way, everything would be completely hidden. The search began with 532 women. Unfortunately, by that time, 3 years had already passed since Yara's death. We're talking about a place like Italy, where you can drive for a while and already be in another country. So it would have been very easy for the killer to just leave the area without saying anything and without worrying about it. Even so, they had to keep investigating. The police kept investigating using tactics that some people considered questionable. Apparently, they listened in on phone calls and planted microphones, just like they had done before. But it was thanks to these questionable tactics that they found a woman who finally seemed to be the one they were looking for, Esther Arzuffi. During the 1960s, Esther was Giuseppe's neighbor and at the time was married to a man named Giovanni Bossetti. In the 1960s, she worked at a textile factory and took the same bus that Giuseppe drove. So they wanted to give her a DNA test, but realized they had already done it and that the lab that performed it had made a mistake. They had messed up the way they did it, which caused the test to fail. So without wasting too much time, they went to collect her DNA again and finally sent it to the lab, making sure it was done correctly. This time, the results showed that she was indeed the woman they were looking for. She was the killer's mother. But I think this is the worst part of the whole case. They had to go from town to town checking who matched the DNA, only to realize that Giovanni and Hester lived in the same town as Yara. In other words, the killer, her son, lived in the same town. The couple had 3 children in total, a pair of twins, a girl and a boy, and a third child, their brother. I'd say, well, obviously the third child is probably the killer. Well, no, they tested the third child and it wasn't him, so he was ruled out. Obviously, the twin sister wasn't going to be the one, so that left the twin brother. So the one left was Massimo Bossetti, a 42-year-old man married with 3 children who lived in Mapello, where Yara's phone had last pinged. He hadn't given his DNA sample. According to what his friends said, he was a party guy, nicknamed the Animal. As you can see, he had very striking light-colored eyes and was completely tanned. The police clearly couldn't make another arrest and risk looking bad in front of everyone, so they had to proceed very carefully. They couldn't just go and ask him for a DNA sample because they were afraid he'd realize what was happening and might try to run while it was being collected. So they watched him for a few days and decided to do the following. They set up a traffic checkpoint on the route he usually took. At this checkpoint, they would give him a breathalyzer test, which meant he'd have to blow into a device, so he wouldn't suspect anything. So while he was driving with his wife and kids in the car, the checkpoint stopped him. The police then gave him the test, pretended that the first test didn't work, so they had him do it again, and in the end, they had 2 different DNA samples to test, so there would be less room for error. The next day, June 16th, 2014, they confirmed that this man, Massimo Bossetti, was the killer. And before moving on to the rest of the case, I also want to share a little fun fact with you. And that is, on the day Massimo was arrested, Giovanni, his father, realized that, well, he wasn't his biological son. In other words, his sister wasn't his biological daughter either. And on top of that, the other son, the one who wasn't a twin, wasn't his biological child either. In other words, he realized that none of his children were actually his, that his wife had been cheating on him for years, and on top of all that, he was later diagnosed with cancer, so that was a really bad year. So let's move on to the arrest. When we look at this arrest, it's pretty standard. The military police go to Massimo's workplace, who, by the way, had never been arrested or anything like that before. They take him in, and he denies having anything to do with the murder. The thing is, his wife said that he had been at home with her and their kids on the day of the disappearance. On the other hand, he had this excuse that at that time his nose was bleeding a lot, so he would usually clean himself up and leave the dirty tissues or towels next to his tools. That's how he ended up mentioning that someone had stolen his work tools along with the towels, using the excuse that probably someone else, someone from his job, had taken the tools and left the blood at the crime scene. But the other side of all this is that they were able to compare the vehicle from the security footage, that white construction-type car, a very distinctive vehicle, with Massimo's, and they turned out to be identical. So he said the reason he was there with the car was because he was coming home from work and had to take that route. However, the police later confirmed that he hadn't gone to work that day. Throughout the entire legal process, there were fears that Massimo might try to escape, so he was kept in prison until the trial. By the time the trial began, a year had passed, and they already had a lot of evidence showing he wasn't innocent. Even so, he swore he was. On top of everything, his wife kept insisting that Massimo had dinner at home on the day of the incident, right at the time the crime was committed. And to make him seem more innocent, Massimo's defense used something completely unexpected. They put Sylvia Brenna, that is, Yara's coach, on the stand as the main witness, the focus of the defense. It turns out her father confirmed seeing her crying the night of the disappearance, without any explanation. Let me remind you that at that time, no one knew Yara was dead, and that Sylvia and her brother had exchanged text messages that very night, which they immediately deleted. Only those messages. But to make matters worse, and this is the lowest point of the entire defense, during a forensic investigation, traces of blood were found on Yara's jacket. Not Yara's blood, nor Massimo's, but Sylvia Brenna's. Sylvia never could explain how her blood ended up on the jacket. Even so, putting that aside, everything was stacked against Massimo. Leaving Sylvia aside, he was the only one to blame. It was found that, normally, Massimo would go to places near Yara's house, close to the gym where she trained. On different security cameras, he was seen hanging around the gym and even eating at a pizzeria near Yara's family. He also had the tanning salon, which he went to twice a week, near the gym. But one of the most disturbing details was that he turned off his cell phone at 5:45 p.m. on the day Yara disappeared and didn't turn it back on until 7:34 a.m. the next morning. And on top of all that, the fibers found on Yara's body were identical to the fibers from the seats of Massimo's car. Testimonies from local people, around 7 p.m., someone was taking out the trash and saw a car that looked a lot like Massimo's, with a girl or boy, he didn't know at the time, screaming inside. Obviously, he went to the police as soon as he heard about Yara's case. Other witnesses in the case said that Massimo only spent the nights at his house, which clearly meant he had time to commit the crime and go out to dinner. With all this, on July 1st, 2016, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. That is, a life sentence. Yara's parents were also awarded compensation of 400,000 euros. The case had a huge impact on the lives of many people. Not just because the DNA investigation uncovered several illegitimate children from various couples, which I didn't think was relevant to mention at the time since it had nothing to do with the case, but aside from that, one of the biggest impacts was on the families involved. Yara's family didn't get any rest until the trial was over, and even after that. Something else that happened, which never should have, is that Massimo's twin sisters suffered the consequences of being his sister. She was exposed in the media, and sometimes when she went out, people would hit her. She was attacked just for being Massimo's sister, the sister of Yara's killer. Besides that, there was always the lingering doubt about whether Sylvia had anything to do with the case or not. Although I should tell you that the police never considered her a suspect, so she had nothing to do with it, as far as we know. Regardless of the blood that was found, which, by the way, wasn't much, just a few tiny spots. I think it was something like that. Anyway, that's the whole case for today. I hope you enjoyed the investigation. It's tragic, but at least it's a solved case. Finally, we at least have the culprit. His face is everywhere when you talk about this case, when you look it up. So at least justice was served, since he's serving a life sentence. Just to clarify, he also tried to get out of prison. In other words, he tried to appeal his case, but they didn't let him. His appeal was denied, so he's going to stay in prison. But anyway, that's as far as we go with this case. On the side are my Patreons. Thank you so much for supporting me. Thank you all so much for your support. Just know that I appreciate you all a lot. My cat isn't here. I brought her, but she doesn't want to cooperate. She went to the living room, in case you're wondering. She's not in the mood, and that's totally fair. But anyway, that's the end of the video. Here's a new video for you. Here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!